My name is Rosemary Barberet, and I am the chair of this session. I am the UN representative for the organization Criminologists Without Borders and also for the International Sociological Association. This is a session about the safety of women and girls in educational settings, and it is co-sponsored by the Division on Women and Crime of the American Society of Criminology, by the World Society of Victimology, by the International Sociological Association, and by Criminologists Without Borders. I have a few housekeeping details before we start. Please silence your phones. Please don't sit on tables or floors. Please wait until the end of our session to ask questions. All of you have an index card to write your questions on, which we'll collect for the Q&A. And please don't consume any food in this room or sell any products. As you can tell, we are having this session videotaped so that those who aren't here can learn from our panelists and our group discussion. This will be available on social media, so if there's anybody who does not want to be included in the videotape, I would ask that you remove yourself from the line of the camera so that you won't appear. The session today, as I said, is co-sponsored by 4 organizations, all of which have a keen interest in the safety of women and girls. This is also one of the key priorities of UN Women and obviously very relevant to the theme of social protection of women and girls at this year's CSW. We are aiming to look at this topic of the safety of women and girls in a variety of countries and educational settings, be they schools or institutes of higher education. And we are obviously concerned with barriers that stand in the way of girls and women's human right to education, be they barriers that exist on the journey to school, be they the fear of victimization that may prevent girls from attending school, be it bullying, sexual harassment, or campus sexual violence that prohibits girls and women from benefiting from their opportunities in education. We have a number of distinguished panelists today. Our first panelist is Dr. Elaina Behounek, assistant professor at Middle Georgia State University, whose research areas include domestic violence and sexual assault. Then we have from Greece, Ms. Eleni Fotou, who will talk about empowering school children in Greece in identifying, reporting, and standing up to violence and discrimination. She is a forensic psychologist, a PhD candidate at the Democracies University in Greece, and works at ViaStop, which is an institute for the prevention and treatment of violence and the promotion of gender equality. After that, we have one of the student members of the Division on Women and Crime of the American Society of Criminology, Ms. Amelia Roskin-Frazee, and she is an activist and currently studying at Columbia University here in New York. Our second to last speaker is Ms. Alethia Jimenez, a policy specialist for ending violence against women at UN Women here in New York, but who also has past experience working for UN Women in Cairo. And she will speak about prevention and response to violence against women in university campus settings, one of the new guidance notes produced by UN Women. And finally, the chair of the Division on Women and Crime of the American Society of Criminology, Dr. Sheetal Ranjan, associate professor at William Paterson University in the United States, will speak about her own area of expertise, campus violence prevention, and coordinated community response. So I will first call on Dr. Behounek for her intervention. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you all for coming to our session. I'm really excited to speak to you all today. And my presentation is actually the title of the whole session today. So I'm going to be speaking about safety of women and girls in educational settings. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here. So I will focus on the UN's own goals for sustainable development, which includes gender equality and education. These two goals are connected and vital to our success as a world. When half of our population are not able to contribute in meaningful ways, we all suffer. There are 5 main areas that I'm going to be focusing on, and I think that all policy and initiatives should have these as central to their ideas. First is intimate partner violence, domestic abuse, whatever you'd like to call it. The second is child brides. The third are cultural norms about gender and divisions of labor. Sexual assault and sexual harassment is the 4th area, and then 5th would be economic freedom. I'll discuss each of these independently, but realize they are all part of the larger social structural condition, which has created a world in which men are valued more than women, and girls experience violence, economic and social inequality, which all contribute to a lack of safety of women and girls in educational settings. While the information I present is international in scope, there are some suggestions which are specific to the United States, which is where I do most of my research, and I will try to note that whenever possible. So as I mentioned, 2 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the UN member states in 2015 are gender equality and quality education. The goals provide a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. The reason I include both goals is because they are related in very important ways. I'm going to provide a wealth of information regarding the continued inequality of women and girls and the ways that we face this in educational attainment, safety in schools, and opportunities for diverse education. I'm going to focus on providing policy suggestions and proposed solutions to the problems. Unequal access to education is a source of marginalization and oppression for women and girls around the globe and has profound impacts. The UN Development Report indicates that gender inequality is a major barrier to human development. All research and practice should be grounded in feminist theory and rely on women's voices and be intersectional in its approaches. While there are many indicators of gender inequality, I'm going to list a few important statistics, which most of us in this room probably already know, but I think it's important to understand the scope of the issue that we're dealing with. 120 million girls have experienced forced sex or other sexual acts. Women and girls experience sexual harassment at staggering rates. They range, there's tons of research, but a few studies indicate that in Bangladesh, 57% of women and girls have experienced some form of sexual harassment, and up to 99% in Egypt. Almost 750 million women and girls alive today are married before their 18th birthday. Gender-based violence or violence against women and girls is a global pandemic that affects 1 in 3 women and girls in their lifetime. 35% of women worldwide have experienced either physical and or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence. Globally, 7% of women have been sexually assaulted by someone other than a partner. And globally, as many as 38% of murders of women are committed by their intimate partner. 200 million women have experienced female genital mutilation or cutting. So these issues are directly related to the safety of women and girls in education, in that societal norms relegate women and girls to a lower status than that of men. Women are seen as less than men, and we experience inequality as a result. Educational attainment and safety in schools is related to violence against women and girls. Women face a culture of violence, harassment, exclusion, and fear in their educational journey. According to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, 1 in 5 women and 1 in 16 men are sexually assaulted while in college. More than 90% of sexual assaults go unreported. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that the data does not even reflect what's really happening. Nearly 2/3 of college students experience sexual harassment, and among college women, 9 out of 10 victims of rape and sexual assault know their offender. Vital to this conversation are the cultural norms that perpetuate inequality. It is my argument that in order for women and girls to live safely, education is vital, and safety within that setting is a part of that. Sexual harassment in schools is widespread. For example, in Brazil, research suggests that 8% of students from 5th to 8th grade have witnessed sexual violence within the school environment. Girls experience violence on their way to school. In a study from Tanzania, 23% of women aged 13 to 24 reported suffering at least one incident of sexual violence traveling to or from school. A similar study in Zambia found that 19% of women reported their first incident of sexual violence occurred before the age of 18 on their way to or from school. Violence against women leads to lower educational attainment. And a study in Nicaragua, for example, found that 63% of the children of abused women, so intergenerational violence, had to repeat school and dropped out of school on average 4 years earlier than others. A slightly higher proportion of female than male students report being bullied at school in the United States. So I'm going to focus on two key areas here. I think schools can be one of the biggest sources of empowerment and reducing inequality. So I'm going to give some specific policies for schools, but then also for legislation and bigger policy changes. So key strategies for schools. A little background of why I think this is important is because schools are an important source of children's socialization. Education is a powerful tool for empowerment, and schools can contribute to building respectful relationships between boys and girls. School environments can also reflect characteristics of the communities that surround them, and often do. And so if we increase gender norms, acceptance of gender fluidity and things like this, and have intersectional analysis, then we can reduce violence against women and girls, which helps with educational attainment. Across the globe, there are girls who face violence in and around and on the way to and from schools. This violence includes sexual harassment, assault, and bullying, and is perpetuated by other students, out-of-school youth, teachers, school administrators, and others. So I'm just going to take one moment to highlight a program that has seen incredible success in India. It's called Educate Girls, and they created a comprehensive model for government reforms through community ownership. So the communities really take ownership of changing norms and allowing women to have access to education. So it was established in 2007. Educate Girls is a nonprofit that focuses on mobilizing communities for girls' education in India's rural and educationally, they refer to them as backward areas. Through community intervention, there's been an increase in girls' literacy in India. The approach tackles the vital importance of shifting norms and attitudes of women and girls from that of a burden to seeing women and girls as a vital resource for the community. So by utilizing existing resources, people within the community, and conversations with families, ideas are slowly changing. The outcomes have been really incredible. On its completion in 2018, Educate Girls achieved 160% of their final learning target, reaching over 7,000 children. Programs such as this are successful because they utilize existing resources, community members who know the cultural norms and values in place, and start there towards community-based change. So what I think schools can really do, a few suggestions would be provide gender sensitivity training for teachers, create a school environment that rejects and prevents violence, including violence against women and girls, offer specialized courses on human rights, including women's rights, and fostering nonviolent social relationships and mutual tolerance among students, reform educational sector laws and policies, improve the institutional response to violence against women and girls at the school level, promote community mobilization in support of girls' safety and rights, and the education sector should collaborate with other sectors to ensure that girls and young women's well-being is safeguarded. The educational sector should be a vital support to community-level social norm behavior change interventions to reduce the acceptability of violence against women and girls. And then some policy and practice recommendations. I think one of the biggest sources of disempowerment and intergenerational experiences of lack of educational attainment is because of economic empowerment. So one thing that we could hopefully suggest and change would be economic empowerment for women and girls through microloans for women. I don't know if you're all familiar with these are microloans or small loans that are made for the purposes of financing businesses. And those loans have proven very successful across the globe in helping women to gain economic empowerment. Increased data collection and research, dissemination about the many ways that gender-based violence impacts women and girls as it relates to opportunities and experiences in education, which is something I'm sure you've heard a lot of here. But we really need to focus on an intersectional analysis and disaggregate the data so we can really see what's happening. Excuse me. And we need to urge legislators to maintain the highest standards for processes related to Title IX complaints in the schools. This is a US-based suggestion, but Title IX is legislation that works to create equity in education through funding decisions. And Title IX legislation is used to deal with really important issues related to gender-based violence, sexual assault, and harassment. And there have been changes proposed right now by the current administration that would lead to potentially devastating effects for victims of violence in college. We need to really change norms and beliefs surrounding gender while being aware of and working within local communities. And I know that that's going to be one of the most challenging things to address. And but we see things happening like Educate Girls in India that are very successful that we could try to initiate other places. We can create a task force to research best practices for local communities to understand how initiatives are being implemented and their successes and failures. Harsher sentencing for perpetrators of gender-based violence. Better systems in the criminal justice system for investigating and adjudicating gender-based violence, and broader monitoring framework to assess the impact of the 2016 Global Education Monitoring Report. And I'm out of time, but I wanted to say that I think long-term developmental change can take time and commitment, and we should seek ways to maybe offer incentives to local communities to help them make these societal changes that are so important. Thank you.
For those of you who came in late, we'll be taking questions at the end. Everybody should have an index card at their seat where they can write a question down, which we'll collect. And those of you standing up, there's probably about half a dozen seats here in front if you want to come and have a seat. Next, I'll call on Ms. Eleni Fotou from Greece.
So first, I would like to thank the Division of Women in Crime of the American Society of Criminology for providing a platform for us and for such an illustrious event. I am honored to be included in this panel among such esteemed colleagues. I would also like to personally thank Dr. Sheetal and Ranjan, both for the hospitality, for taking such an avid interest in our work, and also for the pictures that you will see in my presentation that she took during one of her visits in Greece, when we happened to have one of our events. So you'll see her work as a photographer as well. So first I will give you a small background of the current situation in Greece, the challenges we're facing as a society, and then I will describe how the implementation of an interdisciplinary task force in the NGO VSTOP helps to address violence in schools. So, in 2011, in Greece, the adult literacy level was 97.13%, which is representative of a European nation. So we have a high literacy level. However, in the following years, specific socioeconomic challenges arose that caused systemic problems, affecting particularly girls, far more vulnerable, especially when resources previously available to them diminished. So the new challenges that we faced was first the financial crisis, which started in 2009. It saw a decrease of funding for education of 37%, leading to understaffed schools, particularly in the Greek islands and in remote locations, and the additional loss of parental income increased hardships for school children. In addition, in most rural areas, the loss of parental employment affected women more than men, which regressed in many cases the role of women inside the family towards a more patriarchal setting. Secondly, the migrant crisis, which began in 2015, continuing up until today, introduced a new challenge for us, making a conscientious effort in educating refugee children who were accommodated in camps. A specific challenge was the change of parental perception regarding the education of girls, as in their country of origin, education for women was not always viewed favorably. The main challenges there was that due to the fact that most refugee children's country of origin was going through war, there has been no formal education, especially for children born from 2007 onwards, meaning that many refugee children are in fact illiterate. Greece is not the final destination for most refugees. Most children remain in the Greek school system from 6 months up to 2 years, according to the time allowed for the asylum petition to be processed, which is an insufficient amount of time to allow for significant impact in literacy efforts to be taken into place. Also, they do have to learn Greek and then another language when they move on further up. From the time 2015 to 2016, any educational program taking place in camps were uncoordinated efforts from volunteers, mostly from abroad, and only the past 2 years we see governmental programs allowing refugee children to attend public Greek schools. So thirdly, in the past 5 years, there is a slight increase in middle and high school truancy and dropout rates, following a large wave of middle school children dropping out in 2006-2007, caused by various socioeconomic reasons. But also academic failure in adolescence has been associated with chronic victimization and bullying. Moreover, we have a loss of trust in the judicial system and law enforcement from students and educators alike, leading to increasing rates of delinquency, underreporting of crimes, specifically of sexual offenses and domestic violence, crimes that affect females in overwhelming numbers rather than men. This is a significant challenge as we start witnessing gender-aggressive behaviors during adolescence, specifically during the first formating of behaviors, of relationships. For girls, we have some gender-specific challenges. The decrease in educational programs and resources on sexual behaviors have led to inadequate knowledge on reproductive health. As a result, local health authorities report a significant increase in underage pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, and Kavala police authorities, which is the city where we operate, report increasing numbers of sexual assault with adolescent girls as victims. And also the increase of digital device usage has led to significant and rapid increase of cyberbullying incidents, where peer aggression among girls has a remarked presence over boys. And now, taking a feminist perspective on aggression, a well-balanced bullying intervention program should therefore incorporate a community-based approach with representatives from all and most important agencies in the community. So we at the BL Stop, aiming at targeting all violent behaviors, decided to create a task force to go into schools with many people from all the local authorities. So we included the hospital, the police, the municipality, the Board of Education, members of special education, and of course from us. So the task force comprises of a psychologist, a forensic psychologist, a forensic pathologist, a special education teacher, a health visitor, and a male and female high-ranking police officers. So the high visibility of a uniformed police officer, for us, it's instrumental in combating prejudice in children regarding the police and in addressing relationships, aggressions in adolescents. Health professionals in the task force are also instrumental in addressing issues particularly relating to sexual and reproductive health. The task force, in the past 6 years, we have observed the following. An increase in communication and sharing of information has led to significant improvement and handling of domestic violence incidents and the communication between the different agencies. And rapid and to-the-point resolution of bullying and domestic violence incidents, a significant increase of reporting of sexual offenses from minors directly to the police, and the successful prosecution of these incidents. More specifically, in 2015, 17 cases were brought to the police through the task force interventions. In 11 of these cases, the victims were females. A decrease in negative perceptions regarding police officers, and in particularly when visiting the remote schools, especially with the local officers, school children were encouraged into returning the visit to the police stations, which they did with a great enthusiasm. So we believe that there is a yearly need to form interventions on issues considered taboo in the Greek society, such as sexual orientation. Girls in particular show keen interest in learning about sexuality and frequently report misguided information on sexual behaviors. For example, in the past couple of years, we have heard in the schools, middle schools, that anal sex is seen by adolescent girls as a disease-free alternative to proper intercourse. I know. 20% of school children actually told us that they do carry knives to school in order to protect themselves from harm. These numbers increase in rural settings where children engage in hunting behaviors with their caregivers. Abuse and threatening behavior, unidentified and unreported. Gender and sexual orientation in rural areas are more rigid. So what do we suggest? We suggest that we should have more projects addressing racism, homophobia, and Islamophobia, that law enforcement and judicial agencies should have increased visibility in schools, and special training programs for educators, because they also need to be trained, should be created and also should have mandatory attendance. And women role models are very vital and should be present at schools, especially in rural areas. Police should go inside schools in uniform when possible, and agencies should go out, coordinate with each other, and support without overlapping and without overusing of resources. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for highlighting your very important community-based program that takes on not only gender but also race and ethnicity. And I think this is a theme that we'll see throughout the panel. I'd like to point out that you should have on your seats a reading list that we've compiled of readings from various disciplines in this area, educational safety in schools, that you're welcome to take with you. Most of these readings can be available from a library. We're always happy to facilitate access to them if you can't access them yourselves. Our third speaker is Miss Amelia Roskin-Frazee from Columbia University, Student in Action.
Thank you so much for facilitating this panel, and I also just quickly want to thank all the organizers of this panel for all the amazing work you did getting us here. It's great to be able to participate. I want to start by giving you all some information on my background because it frames the policy and practice proposals I'm going to talk about today. I'm a survivor of campus sexual violence that took place at Columbia University here in New York my freshman year. Sadly, as has been mentioned on this panel, sexual violence is not an uncommon thing for a female-identified college student to experience while in school. In 2015, the American Association of Universities conducted a nationwide study that found 20% of female-identified college students in the US are sexually assaulted while in college. In addition, the Centers for Disease Control Prevention says 10% of US students are sexually assaulted before that in elementary, middle, and high school. Despite these statistics, many schools try to ignore sexual violence on campus. Title IX, a US statute for schools that receive federal funding that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, forces schools to investigate violence against women on campus and provide accommodations to survivors of violence to help them make it through school. However, Title IX is rarely enforced, especially recently. After my assaults, I learned firsthand how the safety of women isn't prioritized in education, even in a country that provides educational opportunities to women and girls. My school failed to investigate my assaults promptly and provide me with the accommodations necessary to keep me safe. Right now, I'm actually on medical leave from my school for a year because they put the prime suspect in my assault in my dorm, so I could leave for a year or I could stay and risk my safety. So when I say many women drop out of school after experiencing violence, it holds new meaning for me. I am, at least, thankfully only for this year, one of them. Since my assaults, I've been part of organizing efforts through an activist group called Narrative Columbia to improve conditions for survivors of violence. These advocacy efforts have given me insight into potential policy and practice solutions to the violence that disproportionately impacts women in educational settings. My policy and practice proposals, which can be applied to institutions globally, but do base itself on research done at US institutions of higher education, can be boiled down to a single key point I want to emphasize. Violence against women and girls in educational settings cannot be addressed without examining how intersecting identities prevent certain women from accessing anti-violence resources. Academic Kimberly Crenshaw uses the term intersectionality to describe this idea. Crenshaw argues that when we discuss people with different marginalized identities, such as Black women, we cannot just see them as Black or just as women because they experience discrimination both based on being Black and being women. Accordingly, I've learned schools addressing patriarchy and toxic masculinity isn't enough to end sexual violence. Policies and practices around ending violence against women must specifically respond to the needs of women of color, queer and trans women, women with disabilities, and other women with multiple marginalized identities. In 2017, Narrative Columbia launched a campaign to create comprehensive demands for the Trump administration on how to respond to gender-based violence in schools. In order to try to understand what students nationwide with different experiences needed, I conducted informal interviews with 48 self-identified survivors of college campus sexual violence nationwide, most of them women. While this was a more informal project for the purpose of creating a petition, I still think it's worth noting some trends. When it came to reporting violence to school officials, something necessary for a perpetrator to be potentially removed from the school, there was a huge disparity based on race and sexual orientation. White, cisgender, heterosexual students in the US that I interviewed reported assaults to their schools at significantly higher rates than the students of color and queer students I talked to. The students of color in particular cited being fearful of retaliation from administrators and perpetrators as a key factor in their decision not to report. Several students of color also feared forced law enforcement involvement, which they felt could endanger their lives. In terms of investigation outcomes in schools, the results were equally skewed. Of the students I talked to who reported, there were 28 of the 48 who did report. The majority of white students who reported being assaulted, 13 of 19, had their cases moved to a hearing panel stage after an initial investigation by the school, whereas only 2 of 9 students of color had their cases moved to a hearing panel. The other 7 of 9 cases were completely dropped by the school with a finding of no responsibility. The 3 findings of responsibility from the cases that moved to a hearing panel, the only 3 times of the 28 cases that were reported where schools decided the perpetrator broke school rules, all involved white, cisgender, heterosexual survivors. This project reaffirmed for me the importance of looking at the experiences of different survivors when drafting solutions. Some of the key demands from the 2017 Title IX campaign that I think could benefit schools globally address the issues I referenced above. First, creating amnesty policies for survivors for any rules violations committed before their assaults, such as consuming alcohol or drugs, ensuring school discipline is totally separate from law enforcement to protect the safety of those vulnerable to police violence, and outlining protections for students without citizenship status so they don't fear deportation. Some survivors I talked to didn't feel like the violence that happened to them really counted in their school's eyes as sexual violence. One woman I talked to who felt this way was threatened with being outed as queer unless she had sex with her partner. While this threat can be scary to queer people in the US, many queer family rejection and similar things, there are some countries in which being outed as queer can lead to prosecution and death, making the threat of being outed extremely dangerous and coercive globally. We asked for the threat of outing someone as queer or trans to be included as a safety issue in school policies. And while the US perhaps unsurprisingly didn't incorporate that into their proposed Title IX guidance, Columbia University did add it to its own policy, and I hope to see schools in other countries ultimately add it as well. However, while educational institutions globally can adopt various policies that try to protect women from violence, without certain practices that provide care to survivors with different identities, these policies are, I argue, meaningless. One key issue that comes up repeatedly when we discuss school violence against women is healthcare. Depending on where a woman lives, it can be difficult or impossible to get emergency contraceptives, medications to treat or prevent STIs, abortions, trauma-informed counseling, and other services. The World Health Organization points out that in 2013, over 300,000 women globally died from pregnancy-related complications, and the nonprofit organization Feminist Majority points out that 70,000 women die annually from unsafe abortions. Identity plays a big role in which women can access health care after experiencing sexual violence, even in the US. The last thing a queer rape survivor wants to hear on a school crisis hotline, if they are lucky enough to have one, is the insinuation that they should have been on birth control, even though they are queer. Yeah, that's what happened to me. The last thing a low-income survivor wants to hear is that they would have to travel several hours to get a rape kit or would have to pay $1,000, and I know people who that's happened to as well. Both of those experiences can turn women away from health care they might otherwise be able to access due to their identities or circumstances. The importance of taking care of the health of those who experience violence led over a dozen students, including myself, to take part in a 4-day nonviolent sit-in at Columbia University last April to demand Columbia have free 24/7 health care, including trauma-informed counseling. They were told repeatedly that having this kind of support for survivors would be too expensive and just wasn't financially worth it. I really don't like reducing people to a dollar value, especially when we all know that a dollar looks very different for women than it does for men. But for argument's sake, let's look at that theoretically. Is healthcare for survivors really as expensive as it is to deny women access to education? As I referenced before, many women who experience violence in school wind up dropping out entirely out of necessity. And investing in support services for women who experience violence, schools will increase the chance those women will be able to stay in school and have more opportunities to contribute to society after. Countries, I argue, would therefore be well served making financial contributions to school support services for survivors that give all survivors, regardless of identity, access to proper care. Now, there are dozens more policy and practice proposals from the 2017 letter I sadly don't have time to share with you, but I'll reiterate one key takeaway I have after working with survivors of violence over the last 4 years. While the solutions each school prioritizes will have to depend on what unique issues are at play at that school and in that school's country, we all need to see the safety of women and girls in school globally as about more than just gender. It's about how gender interacts with other identities like sexuality, race, immigration and socioeconomic status, and ability. Policies that specifically protect women in each country who experience marginalization are vital, as is funding for comprehensive support services for those who are assaulted. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Amelia. Thank you for denouncing your injustice. Thank you for sharing your experience with us. And thank you for your sophisticated research analysis and telling us what needs to be done from a personal and professional perspective. Thank you. Our next speaker is Alethia Jimenez from UN Women.
Thank you, and first of all, thank you for the organizers for this space, for the event, but most importantly, thank you to Amanda for sharing and also giving us recommendations about what needs to be done. I went to university 17 years ago, and it not only worries me, but it angers me that 17 years ago, I was also a survivor of sexual harassment, physical violence, and stalking in my university. And it angers me and it worries me that 17 years later, we are still hearing about this, and it gets more and more out there how severe this problem is. We heard about statistics from the US. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the statistics I have here, but I really hope that 10, 17, 15 years from now, in 2030, that we're not standing here still talking about this, because it is unacceptable that women and girls have to leave school and suffer the impacts of violence. So what is UN Women doing about this? So we've been looking at a few of the knowledge and policy gaps that exist, and with you have a guidance note on campus violence prevention and response, and I'm going to talk about a few of the contents of that. But I mean, we've heard from Amanda that 20% of female college students experience sexual assault in the US. In Spain, 62% of students also report experiencing or witnessing some form of gender-based violence. In Cairo University alone, 70% of women have reported experiencing sexual harassment. 76% in Bangladesh across 8 universities also report experiencing sexual harassment. And we know that even those who report violence are not all of those who have experienced violence. So universities should be safe, empowering spaces for learning, exchange, where new ideas and research emerge. And in the midst and the aftermath of the Me Too, the Time's Up, the Ni Una Menos, and other similar movements, there has been at least some increased attention and studies and work that has been done around prevention and response to campus violence. Ending violence against young women is a central aspect of UN Women's work on youth and gender equality, and we have it as part of our strategy. We know that young women are at a higher risk of experiencing different forms of gender-based violence. Another study that has recently, it's not recent, but two of the studies that really have shocked me is one that was conducted in 2017 about the understanding of men in relation to consent. But the majority of men reported that if they perceived a sexual desire from a woman, and then she stopped communicating the consent and she stopped responding, but she didn't resist, then that meant it was consent. A similar study was done recently in Germany, and we had very shocking similar results about the understanding of consent. So we clearly have a very different and problematic understanding of what consent is. We were talking about what are some of the biggest gaps and areas that need more investment. And we know from what was just said, the cost of violence is much, much larger than the cost of preventing it. So in one of my recent conversations with students from one university, they were saying that there's a lot of student-led activism, but they have gotten zero support from the university. to continue their efforts, and they're worried that this efforts will not continue after they graduate. It's led by student clubs. So student-led activism is super important, but it needs to be complemented by institutional response. So the Campus Violence Guidance Note that we just launched a few weeks ago talks about what are the 10, we call it the 10 essential actions. And if you don't have time to read the full thing, you can look at this one-pager. What are the 10 essential actions that need to be part of an institutional response within a university setting to prevent violence against women in this setting? And it also complements a very important aspect that we think is also very much unseen and underfunded, and not enough attention is going to it in the area of prevention. They need to challenge norms of masculinity and traditional gender roles. They need to have better recognition and action of the root causes of violence against women and the stereotypes that are enforced by unequal power relations. We need to also look at how do we convert action from a community educational level to a national and state level and global level. So I would like to very much thank Dr. Sheetal, Ranjan, and all of the people that have put their efforts in reviewing this guidance note. It is just a start. It is just one of the many things that have been put out there to address this pandemic. But essentially, we want to make sure that we build cultures of zero tolerance on violence against women. And we also need to understand how do these commitments on paper get turned into action. So the guidance note is based on 4 key principles that were already mentioned. The key to a successful intervention needs to be survivor-centered and informed by the voices of those who have experienced violence and those who are working on the prevention of violence. It needs to be human rights-based. It needs to be comprehensive. We know from the evidence that one-off interventions do not work. Very little work, in fact, on this area of prevention on violence against women in university settings has been thoroughly evaluated and tested. So more of that needs to be done. But the evidence that exists around the violence against women world shows that one-off interventions, one-off trainings do not work. So we need a comprehensive, long-term, sustained approach to end and change this problem. And then another key element that we don't talk enough about is what was mentioned just now. How do we make our interventions intersectional? How do different women and girls are affected by race, sex, religion, nationality, sexual orientation, and other factors? Not all women and girls are affected in the same way by violence and discriminated in the same way by different institutions. So we need to carefully look at that. Another thing I wanted to share with you is another piece of work that is more targeted towards policymakers. And I have left a few copies outside and I have a couple of extra with me. It's the School-Related Gender-Based Violence Guidance Note. So this is more generic around all the educational institutions, and it was done in partnership with UNESCO and UN Women. And it's supposed to be a one-stop resource center for national education policy makers, education ministries, school administrations, and other staff. And another really important work is through our He for She campaign, there's been an action toolkit developed that is targeting students, also to say and to articulate what can be done in university campuses. So I would like to conclude by saying that violence against women in university campuses has been going on for too long. It's too severe and too widespread. And it has begun to attract more attention. So the movements to end impunity on violence against women in different settings also gives us the opportunity and the imperative to take action and hold duty bearers accountable, as well as to continue to grow the social movements to change the norms and standards that condone violence, to help us create educational institutions and communities where every woman and girl lives a life free of violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alethia. All of us, of course, are very heartened to hear of the emerging work of UN Women in this very important area. Our final speaker will build on your suggestions for coordinated community response, in other words, sustained interventions and prevention in higher education settings. Dr. Sheetal Ranjan.
Thank you, Rosemary, and thank you to all the panelists for being amazing speakers. When we started out with putting this whole event and all our CSW63 events together, I really couldn't have imagined, along with my committee members, how fabulous each one would be and how these stories would shape And especially thanks to my DWC student member, Amelia. She's been phenomenal. And she worked with our team and Elaina, who was on the committee, to draft a Title IX response to the current proposed changes by our education secretary. So I want to give a shout out to them over here for that. And that said, today I want to talk about violence prevention. Okay, prevention using a coordinated community response approach. This presentation that I'm making today is part of a multiple book series that I'm authoring on violence prevention. And as my earlier panelists have discussed, violence against women and girls is a serious barrier to education. And around the world, you're seeing numbers, women and girls face difficulties in accessing educational opportunities. It's a human right, it's a public service and enshrined in, UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And still here, as Alethia said, 17 years later, we're still talking about it. And it's in the CEDA, it's in the SDGs, and they threaten in many ways, primarily sexual harassment, dating violence, sexual violence, stalking, and that's going to be the focus of what I'm talking about today. So if you look at Alethia's guidance note, you will see the last two points are related to prevention. And I want to say that I'm speaking to those 2 points. So prevention is key to a multi-pronged strategy to address this problem, right? We know this because at an international level, in a first survey of its kind, WHO, the UNDP, the UNODC jointly published the Global Status Report on Violence Prevention in 2014. They wanted to examine what is being done in various countries around the world to prevent violence. Because we've been intervening, but prevention also has to happen at a very larger scale so that future generations do not have to encompass the violence that we're seeing. And CSW63 in 2013 adopted the agreed conclusions on the elimination and prevention of all forms of violence against women and girls, further solidifying the idea of prevention. So one of the conclusions in the landmark document clearly recognizes the important role of the community in these efforts. So before I get into details of how we do this, I want to provide a little background. I want to draw your attention to the socio-ecological model of violence prevention and where community fits in within this model. And I know most of you in this room are very familiar with this 4-level socio-ecological model. It provides a framework to understand and prevent violence. It considers the complex interplay between the individual, relationship, community, and societal factors for both perpetration, victimization, but it's also important for prevention. So it compels us to act across multiple levels, all at the same time, to ensure sustainable prevention efforts over time rather than any single intervention. So while my forthcoming book series on violence prevention will address all levels of CDC, I have a contract for about 5 books which address different levels of this issue. My today's focus in today's talk is coordinated community response, which is the first book in this series. And I will try to provide my recommendations and ideas primarily within the context of violence prevention in educational settings. So in most parts of the world, education of women and girls takes place in institutions, schools, colleges, universities, right? This presentation argues that institutions are organizations that operate at a community level. A school is a community, a college is a community, a university is a community. It further argues that the responsibility of providing a safe environment free of violence, free of harassment, is the responsibility of the community. It is not a student's responsibility to keep ourselves safe from violence. It is the responsibility of the community. So within this framework, strategies and recommendations on how to get a violence and harassment prevention program underway at any educational institution are discussed. I'm just laying out the broad ideas from which I draw these suggestions. That this is the responsibility of the community. It's not any individual or any single organization's responsibility. So many of these strategies that I'm speaking about are scalable based on the nature and size of the institution and the political legal climate, in fact, the socio-political legal climate within which they operate. So I will also conclude by providing, because this audience is largely of NGOs, I will provide She shows me the time and I'm freaking out already. So I will provide strategies for NGOs to work with educational institutions using a coordinated response approach to get these projects off the ground. So what is CCR? What is coordinated community response and why is it important? So CCR refers to community-wide efforts to bring together relevant stakeholders to address complex social problems. In this case, we're talking about, the kinds that affect women primarily: partner violence, partner abuse, sexual assault, stalking, and efforts to coordinate these responses developed out of an awareness that multiple stakeholders, such as parents, friends, neighbors, all those who you see here, interact with those affected by these problems, and that they all have a role to play in the solution. So further, unless these stakeholders work together, like you saw in the example that Fotou presented, unless these stakeholders work together, there will be gaps and there will be duplication of efforts. And there'll be gap in the community response. So how do you work this out? So most importantly, for me when I speak of CCR, I want to lay it out there. Most importantly, a coordinated effort emphasizes that it is the entire community rather than isolated agencies or stakeholders that are responsible for addressing this issue. So what's new? What am I saying that's new? Nothing, right? Right. So if you've been around the UN these past few days and just this presentation also, you would have heard the words interagency, multiple stakeholder, comprehensive approach, interdisciplinary. Everybody understands these words. You all understand it numerous times. All of you are nodding right now. All of you nodded every time those words were used. Did you or didn't you? If anybody did not, if anybody disagrees with me, I want you to raise your hand. No one disagrees with me, right? Everyone acknowledges the need for this collaboration. So what's missing? What's missing is no one tells you how to go about it. No one really tells you how to go about this multi-agency collaboration. I know that many of you are already involved in such grassroots efforts to coordinate with multiple agencies. The pictures which Eleni presented in her, which I took pictures when I was in Greece in Kavala, they had this coordinated community response effort going on, which they didn't know was CCR. And I know many of you across the world are doing the same thing. But the thing is, let me ask you, who told you how to go about these collaborations? No one? You?
Yes, we have one. It's a coordinated community response to domestic violence in my county.
Right. But who told you what would work and what wouldn't? Who told you what is sustainable, what makes these efforts sustainable? There really isn't much research and direction in this area. Let me be honest with you. There really isn't much research and direction in the area on how to actually go about it. Everybody uses all the words and everybody agrees, everybody nods, but how do you do it? What will work, right? So there really isn't. Therefore, in the interest of time today, I will just focus on recommendations for violence prevention efforts within educational settings. My recommendations could span a range of, institutions and organizations, but today I'm just going to focus on educational setting. And these recommendations are based on examination of numerous grassroots efforts around the world and my own experiences in getting some of these projects off the ground, right? In multiple settings. So here is what I propose. And this is specifically, it could be for anyone. Start with where you are and who you are. Anyone at any level of any organizational institution can get the process started. You don't have to wait for the next person. You care about this issue, you can get it started, right? If you're an NGO operating in a geographical area of an educational institution, you can get the process started. It could be, one of the focal points of your engagements with the community. Second, as you've heard from various people who spoke today, understand this is a long-term project. It will require sustained effort. This is no gimmick which happens with a few clicks of photograph pushed on social media and say we've done it. It doesn't happen just like that. It happens at a long-term sustained effort. So understand that before you set foot to do this work. Start by educating yourself. Let's say you're an NGO. Let's go with that example. Let's say you're an NGO, an individual in an NGO who wants to do this. Start by educating yourself about the socio-political, legal situation of your country, city, institution, whether it's Columbia or whether it's, university somewhere in a small rural area or a school in Covertony. Understand, what are the rules and laws under which you operate? What are the strengths and weaknesses of those laws and rules? How will they help or hinder your violence prevention efforts in an educational setting? Understanding that is the first key, right? Then once you figure this out and have a clear understanding of how the system works, right? Set about the task of identifying allies to develop a very basic CCR team. Since the goal here is to work in educational settings, and since these settings already comprise of scholars interested in these issues, start with identifying them. Scan through the websites of department websites like sociology, social work, women's studies, criminology, political science, good places to find the scholars who are interested in these issues. Counselors are excellent in school settings. Coaches could be excellent in school settings. When a formal structure does not exist for you to identify, say you don't have a website, you're working in a place where there's no website for the school, you don't know who's there, identify people through your personal connections. You know somebody cares about this issue. It may be a teacher, it may be a coach, it could be anybody. There's always someone who cares about this issue. I would refuse to believe that nobody cares about this issue. It's not an answer. I'm going to take extra time, Dawn. Sorry. I take my privileges as chair. So once you start a team, a basic CCR team has been identified, communicate regularly with them. First, educate them about the laws and statistics that you've educated yourself with, right? Educate them about national, global statistics, but educate them about local statistics right where you are. Share opportunities to network, exchange ideas on socio-political legal climate, communicate one-on-one. So I find it very successful when I communicate with a coach, with a dean, with a provost, and with my victim services agency one-on-one, but also I bring them together as a group. I find that very successful. You cannot just have a meeting and expect all the ideas will be shared. So that one-on-one and community, as a collaborative is very important. Most importantly, set a meeting, schedule, and meet regularly. This work is not something which just happens like that. So you have to set a meeting, schedule, meet regularly, but understand you're not the only expert. Every stakeholder in the room brings relevant experience, knowledge, and perspectives. Make the group a safe place. So I had a situation where the campus police felt totally unsafe and felt like this is not something that they actually care about it. But they felt like they cannot speak their voice because there are these feminists who are going to yell at them and, things cannot happen and we follow Attorney General guidelines. So if you make that space free for them to disclose their fears and challenges, you will get their buy-in and you have to work for that buy-in because without that buy-in, progress is not possible. You could be fighting all you want. So understand that everybody is an expert who comes to the table, that you don't know more than the other. And with that, you will be able to make progress. Leverage allies who have a power to formalize the group or committee. So for example, if you are working in an area where there is a local politician who cares about this issue, and that politician has some influence over your board of governors or something, make them part of your CCR. That will leverage it. That will give it power, to move forward. Give the group a name. Once you get that institutional buy-in at a higher level, give the group a name. Call it a community board, call it a CCR team, call it whatever you want, and set collaborative goals and objectives. So if you can set collaborative goals and objectives and you have the powers that we listen to you, start with developing policies and protocols. And they're two different things. And I have a whole book about it, so I'm going to tell you in 3 sentences. Policies are statements about where the institution stands on certain issues. It's like saying, this is what we believe in. Whereas protocols are how-tos. How will you handle a particular instance when it happens? Do not have to reinvent the wheel. Stand on the shoulders of giants. Borrow the policy ideas and drafts from other institutions. If not in your country, somewhere else, borrow it. And then now you have a CCR team. Work with them to make it amenable to your institution, your culture, and all of that. But it's very easy to borrow. It's all out there. And the UN guidance note, there you go. Borrow from there. And if policies and protocols seem difficult to get off the ground first, which is challenging if you don't have the buy-in of the powers that be, you can start with basic education and prevention programs. They're very innocuous. Nobody minds them. They say, they're doing some violence prevention, education training. And do that. Do that consistently, again and again, so that it starts, building momentum. And that's really important. That's how you work around, systems. You cannot just always make the system bow down to you, and make things happen. In the process, you do have to, create a network of support services, drawing from both institution and community resources. Once you have community resources set, getting resources is much easier. There's no duplication. Be aware of changes in the law. Like in the US, we are getting changes in the law, people will tell you what it is. And be aware of them, be on top of them, advocate for them, and educate each other about it. Work towards making successful programs or projects sustainable, and do not hesitate to drop what does not work or is not sustainable. If you don't have money to, put 1,000 banners of stop sexual violence, it's okay, don't do it, do something else. Be creative, right? And I bring this up last, mainly because many NGOs are struggling with cash flows, right? If you have many of these steps mapped out, like I have said before, and you put your team or your basic CCR in place to identify, you will be in a better place to have a team to identify and apply for funding, right? There may not be resources in every country or community. However, if you do have such opportunities, completing all these tasks ahead of time will make your funding application very strong. Because funding applications come like with a 1-month deadline. Can you create a CCR in 1 month? No, I told you in the beginning, right? This is a long process. So you have to do all of that work ahead of time. And once you're able to do that, you will be able to demonstrate in your application for funding that the CCR infrastructure you have in place, you're able to demonstrate knowledge of issues, mainly because you've already worked over them in time and you already know and understand the needs of the community. So I could give you countless examples based on each of the recommendations I have shared. But I will just leave you with my email, and I'm happy to talk to you later. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your adrenaline.
I know.
Your push to action, which I've observed over the past couple months, and I know it's genuine, and I know that we all feel it in the room. I would ask all of you now, you should have an index card on your chair to pass your questions forward.
Our student, could you collect it?
Sebastian, question. Do you have a strategy to let down the guards of those conservative groups and really help gender minority students be free from bullying and harassment on campus? This is from the Taipei Women's Rescue Foundation. This might be for you, Amelia?
I can answer that. I'm actually, do you want to come speak in the mic? Sure. Yeah. We can pass it to them.
Yeah.
There's something on the back too. What? Excuse me.
There's something on the back.
Oh, there's something on the back. Oh dear.
Okay.
Do you want to go ahead and say it? I can read it.
No, read it.
Okay, I'll read it. My university, National Taiwan University, started a first of its kind committee to cope with sexual harassment on campus in 2002. In 2004, the Gender Equity Education Act passed in Taiwan, and we have 3 level committees to help schools of all levels stop GBV, including those against LGBTIQ students. After 15 years, we still struggle with the climate transformation of schools and more setbacks from conservative groups who used a referendum to kill the education for tolerance and respect for LGBTIQ peers in primary and university and high school.
So, in addition to my work in the Tape and MACSHO, the National Advisory Council for GLSEN, which formerly stood for the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, and then the name just now is GLSEN. And it's the organization that does a lot of work around protecting LGBTQ students in schools in the US, particularly K-12. And they do a lot of research. They do the National School Climate Survey on LGBTQ bullying in schools. And both through that and the Tape, we've had a lot of interaction with different more conservative groups. Even within the anti-violence movement, I would say definitely Tape has come up against a lot of other groups that allegedly are working to end sexual violence. And then we get into fights with them about things like supporting queer students. Definitely when we were creating the Trump letter in 2017, we had some groups refuse to sign on because of things like our demand asking for the separation of law enforcement from Title IX, just as a protection measure, and also for protecting those with who are queer and trans from being outed. So we've had issues with that. One of the things we've done is definitely focus on education and explaining why it's really important to protect particularly queer and trans survivors and queer trans people who are more likely to be assaulted. Definitely we utilize a lot of personal narrative activism and queer trans students talking about their experiences. So I could get into a whole thing about how that is, can easily get exploitative. So definitely there's a lot of that. We also are pretty selective with what groups we work with. We found that building coalitions with other groups that will support our intersectional demands tends to be a more productive measure in the end to help us pass things. And then from there, we can often work with the conservative groups once we get things through and say, well, here's why this is the way it is. But it's definitely a challenge, and sorry you're also dealing with it. It's sad that so many years later, there's definitely a rise in those groups, especially right now in the U.S. with our current administration.
All right, we have another question. Your statistics were enlightening, all speakers. How can I access that information? Elaina, Alethia?
You will find a lot of our statistics in the guidance note, which is online. Just go to unwomen.org and you can look for this. We have all of our publications are there, and we update the statistics in the anti-violence and women section page every year, so we get the latest data from there. There's a lot of studies done by universities in different parts of the world, so you can also find some reference to those, and there's lots of stuff online.
I think most of my statistics made it to the reading list. So if you get that reading list, there's a lot of great resources there. The UN has resources, World Health Organization, CDC, National Violence Resource Center. All of these are great sources, and I can give you my email, my card, if you want any of my statistics.
Which is the barriers that exist for women to take advantage of education in terms of lack of hygienic facilities and shaming involved with menstruation, which I know is very much at the top of the agenda for gender equality.
Menstrual health is a huge issue. I mean, part of the work that is being looked at it from different angles in relation to this is the access of women to any space, right? To any public space within educational institutions, outside educational institutions. So we have a lot of programs addressing that. For example, safe cities and safe public spaces. What does a safe space look like for women? Separate toilets, visible entrances, lit spaces, etc. In relation to menstrual health, I think that's a huge problem in many countries around the world, and it comes also from the issue of taboos, of misunderstanding of women's health and women's needs. So a lot of the work that we're doing, not just as Young Women, but also our sister agencies are doing on this area and the issue of health, is destigmatizing that and looking at working with communities just to really understand that women's health is just health. It's everybody's health. So there's a few interventions, particularly, for example, in countries like India, where that's a big issue of stigma around adolescent girls when they start their menstruation, and is working also with the community leaders, with the gatekeepers, to also start changing the way they think about this. So a lot of the work we do in the United Nations and with civil society and different stakeholders is around changing the perception of what are those things, the issue of sex, the issue of menstruation, the issue of LGBT, of the different groups and representing different groups and accepting that everybody has human rights and the same rights that we should all have. So I hope I covered this.
And now a question to Sheetal about successful examples of coordinated community response.
If you look around on any program that is truly successful, it is only CCRs. Whether they call it that or not, it is always and only CCRs which can be truly successful in changing. You saw the example that Eleni presented from Vietnam. You saw the numbers of reporting increase. I can report at my own campus at Paterson University, which has a funded campus violence prevention program. The reports highly increased after the education and training and all the stuff that we did around prevention. What Alethia mentioned, safe cities. I did my fellowship at the American Society in Cairo. I spent a whole semester there, and they had presentation about safe cities within Cairo. And even safe cities, they don't call it, they call it multi-agency stakeholder, whatever they call it. It is a CCR. They are successful because they are CCR. And if you talk to people on the ground, they will talk about how they collaborated with different agencies and the powers that be, how they found their allies within organizations to move the agenda forward. So everything that is successful is CCR. If it is an individual effort, it's probably not as successful as others.
Okay, we have one additional question, maybe for Alethia and Sheetal, who consulted on this important new guidance note. The question is, how can UN Women's Guidance Note be delivered to a smaller community level? UN Women has been working closely with member states and NGOs. Can we get an example of your approach to delivering the guidance from your agency directly to the school level?
Alethia, I know you can answer. No, I know you can answer that very well.
I do. Hold on. I have my data here. So I have a few examples of how the campus violence note is quite recent, but on the other one that I showed you, the school-related gender-based violence note, in Tonga, you don't hear a lot of examples from Tonga, but in a couple of years ago in Tonga, we were working with university staff, and Tonga is quite a small country in the Pacific, to implement and to unpack this guidance. So, you know, if you see it, for example, in different modules, so sometimes we partner with different universities and communities. So we don't just work with institutions and NGOs. Sometimes it's just the grassroots communities, depending on the context. And the guide, and this had reached 16,800 students, and resulted in the reporting, for example, of 30 rape cases. And the community started coming forward with reporting forced marriages and asking for further guidance on this. So, I mean, community level, let me give you another example, which is not particularly with education, in Papua New Guinea, where I spent a few years of my life. We were working with women in markets, and it was about safe spaces. And it was really about helping the women in the marketplaces who were not organized, they were highly divided by tribal groups because it's a highly tribal society and not very, not very cohesive. There's a lot of problems around social institutions. So we helped the women in the market, which were all experiencing violence. There were several cases of rape reported in the toilet, several cases of transactional sex with the bus drivers, the people collecting the fees. Everybody was abusing these women in many different ways. So we worked with the women to get them, for them to help them organize themselves in community groups. So they have established market vendors associations. And as in women, our role was also to help them facilitate this. Once you have that community group, how do you give the space for them to have access to voice and decision making with the authorities, right? So they had a voice. We didn't have to give it to them. They had it. We just had to create a space. So with the local government, which we had access to and was one of our main partners, once the vendors associations had been organized, we invited them to meetings. We established a steering committee where the women representatives were demanding their rights, saying the toilets are not safe, the sewage is leaking, we're getting cholera outbreaks every other quarter. So, then that was the space where the government started listening. So sometimes our approaches are not just engaging with the community, but finding the space that where does the community need to come and be an influencer, right? It's our role is to facilitate, not to do it. So how do we get the governments to listen? How do we get that advocacy space, like CSW, but it's a much smaller scale for people to demand and claim their rights and hold people accountable. So some of those are the strategies that we apply.
And to answer specifically your question, how do we take the guidance note and how do we apply it in educational setting? I mean, I'm very proud that I participated in some way in the interviews that led to the building of the guidance note. And I can say that with what would come out in my book eventually. But if you look at this, number 6, action items to address campus violence prevention, assess the situation, which is what I said, assess your socio-political legal climate of the institution, of the school, what's going on, and what are the rules that apply, what are the state rules that apply, what are the national rules that apply, put a policy in place. So start out, so to put a policy in place is doesn't just jump from assess the situation to put a policy. I would say in between that is where you have the CCR. Once you have the team in place and once you have buy-in from your higher powers that be, putting a policy in place is much easier. And use the legal norms, use what you have. This is right now the issue that we are facing about violence against women. People say war on drugs, war on this. I'm like, war on violence against, I'm not willing to accept it anymore. We gotta change this. You gotta use everything you have. So whatever you have, use it. Use it. You have people in power, use them. You have people, in uniform, use them. Whatever it takes, do what it takes to, get this agenda moving forward in your communities. It's really important. Otherwise, we'll be sitting here 20 years from now having the same conversation. And so please use that. And the same way, assign, all the action items. There are about 10 listed here, but you got to start somewhere. And, please do.
Are there any other questions from the audience? We have about 5 minutes. Somebody who'd like to explain what their local area is doing?
Just really quickly, if I have this, I don't need the one sheet with that. Oh, I'm sorry. So if I have this guide, I don't need that piece of paper.
You can take it anyway.
Okay, thank you.
And it's available. All the material that Alethia shared is available on UN Women's website in electronic format. So it's just a matter of searching for it.
Any other questions, comments? Thank you very much for attending today. You're welcome to spend the rest of the time networking among yourselves and with the panelists. Thank you.